You know the name. You've heard it 1,000 times. Madeleine McCann. Her disappearance is the most heavily reported mystery of our time. But why, after so many years and so many thousands of headlines, do we still have no real answers? Perhaps it's because we've been told the wrong story. On a quiet May evening in 2007, that name began its slow transformation from that of a child into a symbol of an enduring mystery. But today, we are here on a different mission. We are here to strip away the polished veneer of those headlines. We are here to ask, is the narrative we've all been fed, the story of a stranger in the night, a jimmied shutter, anything more than a carefully managed illusion? What if the phantoms we were told to fear, Tanner Man, Sager's Man, and Smith Man, were never real at all? If you, like us, are sick and tired of the misleading media headlines, and you want to know the real story hiding behind the official one, you have come to the right place. Be sure to hit that like button if you are ready to question everything you've been told. And subscribe right now, because we are about to expose the hard facts of this case, and you will not want to miss a single disturbing detail. It was the 3rd of May, in the year 2007. The Algarve coast, with its gentle breezes and the distant sound of the ocean, was a portrait of tranquility. The resort of Praia da Luz, in particular, was marketed as a sanctuary, a secure haven for families seeking respite from the schedules and stresses of their lives back home. It was here that a group of friends, all professionals and parents of young children, had gathered. Their evenings had fallen into a comfortable pattern, a shared understanding that defined their holiday. While the children slept in the nearby ground-floor apartments, the adults would convene at a tapas restaurant, just a short walk away. This arrangement was built on a foundation of trust in the resort's safety, and trust in each other. They had devised a simple, informal system. Every half hour or so, one of the adults would leave the table, walk the quiet, dimly lit path to the apartments, and visually check on the sleeping children. It was a routine that balanced parental diligence with the desire for adult conversation. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, one of the fathers, Gerry McCann, took his turn. He walked to apartment 5A. He entered and noted that the door to the children's bedroom was open wider than they usually left it. He looked inside. He could see his twin toddlers in their cots. He could also see the bed where his eldest daughter, Madeleine, was sleeping. All seemed quiet. He lingered for a moment, adjusted the bedroom door so it was partly closed again, and then returned to the restaurant, satisfied that all was well. Perhaps 40 minutes passed. More conversation, more of the easygoing atmosphere of a holiday meal. Then it was Kate McCann's turn to perform the check. She walked the same familiar path from the restaurant. But as she approached the apartment, an immediate sense of unease took hold. She entered the apartment, and the feeling intensified. She would later describe an oppressive silence. When she reached the children's bedroom, she found the door thrown wide open. And then, the details that would signal the start of a nightmare. The bedroom window, which had been secured, was now open. The exterior shutter, a heavy, louvered blind, was raised all the way up. In the cool night air blowing into the room, she looked toward the bed where her daughter should have been. It was empty. The twins remained asleep, undisturbed, but Madeleine was gone. A sound of pure, primal despair cut through the night. It was a cry that brought the dinner party to an abrupt and chaotic end. The friends came running, their casual evening shattered, panic ignited. A frantic, disorganized search began immediately, with friends and resort staff fanning out into the darkness, calling her name. But she was nowhere. In those first moments of terror and confusion, the only explanation that seemed possible was the one that was the most horrifying. She had not wandered. She had not fallen. She had been taken. A stranger had entered the room and stolen a child from her bed. This was the story that was born in the darkness, the narrative that would be given to the police, and the story that would, within hours, captivate and horrify the entire world. The story of a child snatched from her bed is a primal fear. It is a narrative that requires no explanation. It is understood instantly and viscerally. By the time the sun rose over Praia da Luz, this story was already hardening into fact in the public mind. An intruder, a phantom, had breached the family's sanctuary and vanished into the night. It was a terrifyingly simple and compelling account. But as the Polícia Judiciária, the Portuguese investigators, arrived and began their methodical, painstaking work, this simple story began to collide with the cold, physical facts of the scene itself. The apartment was now a place of scrutiny, and it was not telling the same story that was being told to the media. The narrative insisted on a forced entry. Yet, the investigators found none. They examined the front door. It was secure. They turned their full attention to the children's bedroom window. This was the supposed point of entry and exit, but the window frame bore no marks of a tool, no splinters of wood, no scratches in the paint. It had not been jimmied, broken, or forced. Then there was the exterior shutter. These were not flimsy curtains. They were heavy, designed for security and to block the strong summer Sunday. To raise such a shutter from the outside without making a significant amount of noise, and without leaving any marks of leverage, was considered incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Yet it was found fully raised, and like the window, it was undamaged. How had a supposed intruder operated this complex mechanism from the outside, in silence, and without leaving a trace? The most profound puzzle, however, was the complete lack of forensic evidence. An abduction is a physical act. A person entering from outside would bring the outside in with them. Dirt on their shoes, fibers from their clothes, a handprint on the wall as they balanced. A stranger in a room, under the immense pressure of committing such an act, would almost certainly leave something of themselves behind. A hair, a drop of sweat, a smear of DNA. The investigators searched. They dusted, they swabbed, and they found nothing. The room was, from a forensic standpoint, sterile. There were no foreign fingerprints. There was no unidentified DNA. There were no scuff marks on the wall beneath the window, nor any disturbed dust on the sill. The only identifiable fingerprint found on the window frame itself was later confirmed to belong to Kate McCann. This was the central, unnerving contradiction that would haunt the investigation from its very first day. The authorities were being told a story of a violent, intrusive, and desperate crime. But the physical evidence in apartment 5A spoke of something else entirely. It did not speak of a stranger's presence. It spoke of an absence. It was a crime scene defined not by what it contained, but by what it profoundly lacked. The official narrative and the silent facts of the room were already at war. Before the first 24 hours had passed, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was no longer just a tragic event. It was a global news story, and it was escalating at a speed that few had ever witnessed. This was not a slow, dawning realization for the world's media. It was an explosion of information. The story, it seemed, was not just reported, it was placed. Even in the pre-dawn confusion of May 4th, phone calls were reportedly being made from Portugal to high-level media contacts in the United Kingdom. Friends of the family, with experience in journalism and political connections, were allegedly mobilizing. The result was that the story was not just on the news, it was the lead story, presented in a very specific and synchronized way. Breakfast television screens across nations were filled with the same terrifying headline: British girl abducted on holiday. The choice of that one word, abducted, was critical. It was not a missing child case, which implies a child could have wandered off. It was, from the very first broadcast, an abduction. This framing was powerful. It created an immediate public image, a predatory stranger, a clear victim, and a desperate race against time. It preset the entire public perception of the case before Portuguese investigators had even been able to release their first official statement. This intense media focus was soon followed by a highly professionalized layer of management. Within days, Clarence Mitchell arrived in Praia da Luz. This was not a minor development. Mitchell was not a simple public relations representative. At the time, he was a high-ranking figure within the British government's own media unit, a man who intimately understood the mechanics of news, the shaping of public opinion, and the art of message control. He was, in effect, a master of the narrative. He was dispatched to act as the family's official spokesman. His role was clear: to streamline the message, to handle the overwhelming press interest, and to ensure that the abduction narrative remained the single, unwavering focus. Every press conference, every release, every televised appeal was meticulously managed. The focus, as was stated repeatedly, must be on Madeleine and the search for her. This powerful machine had an immediate and profound effect. It created a single, dominant story that was broadcast around the clock. This story acted as both a shield and a spear. It shielded the family from difficult or probing questions, and it directed all public energy toward the hunt for a phantom kidnapper. While investigators on the ground were quietly grappling with the troubling silence of apartment 5A, the lack of forensics, the undamaged window, the clean scene, the world was being consumed by a simpler, louder, and far more emotional tale. The narrative machine was running, and it was proving to be more powerful and far faster than the official investigation itself. While the world's attention was captured by the escalating media campaign, a very different story was quietly taking shape within the files of the Policia Judiciaria. The investigators on the ground, led by Chief Inspector Gonzalo Amaral, were facing a stark and troubling reality. The official narrative of an abduction, so powerfully projected to the public, was not aligning with the facts they were gathering. The chasm between the public story and the private investigation was growing wider by the day. The initial investigation had hit a wall of silence. There were no witnesses, no ransom demands, and most importantly, no forensic trail leading away from apartment 5A. The absence of evidence at the window was not just a puzzle, it was a contradiction that undermined the entire premise of an intruder. This forced Amaral and his team to pivot, to look away from the phantom stranger and to re-examine the apartment itself, not as the start of a kidnapping, but perhaps as the end of a different event. To do this, they decided to employ a tool that operated beyond the limits of human sight and perception. They requested specialized scent dogs from the United Kingdom. These were not ordinary tracking hounds. These were highly trained animals, conditioned to detect two specific and profoundly unsettling targets: the scent of human blood and the distinct chemical signature of human death. Weeks had passed since the disappearance, but the dogs were brought into apartment 5A. The handlers led them through the rooms, and the animals began to work. The result was chilling. The dogs, independent of one another, gave strong alerts inside the apartment. They signaled, unequivocally, that the scent they were trained to find was present. One alert was reported to be in the living area, behind a sofa. Another was in the bedroom. This discovery was a quiet bombshell. It suggested a terrible event had left its trace within those four walls. But the investigation did not stop there. The most disquieting discovery was yet to come. Weeks after Madeleine had vanished, the family rented a new vehicle, a silver Renault Scenic. The investigators, now following this grim and difficult line of inquiry, decided to present this car to the specialized dogs. The car was, by all accounts, completely unconnected to the night of May 3rd. The dogs were led to the vehicle. Again, they alerted. They signaled with certainty. The scent they were trained for was detected, this time in the boot of the rental car. This finding was almost incomprehensible. How could the scent of death, which the dogs had signaled in the apartment, also be present in a car that was rented weeks after the disappearance? The implications were staggering and pointed toward a possibility that investigators had begun to fear. These findings, the lack of forced entry, the forensic silence, the alerts from the cadaver dogs in the apartment, and the inexplicable alerts in the rental car formed the basis of a private, official conclusion. This was not mere speculation. On September 10, 2007, Chief Inspector Amaral signed a damning official report. This document, compiled from all the evidence his team had gathered, concluded that the abduction narrative was not supported. The report suggested that Madeleine McCann may not have left apartment 5A alive, and that the subsequent story of a kidnapping could have been a diversion. This official, explosive conclusion was filed away, a secret record kept far from the public eye, even as the world continued its desperate search for a phantom. The official investigation was now fractured, running along two contradictory paths. On one, there was the silent, troubling evidence gathered by Portuguese investigators, the lack of forensics, the scent dogs, the secret report. On the other, there was the powerful, public-facing narrative of abduction, a story that urgently required supporting evidence. It needed a witness. It needed a face. That face was provided on the very first night by one of the holiday group. Her name was Jane Tanner. She was a member of the party and present at the tapas restaurant. According to her account, sometime after 9 o'clock, she left the table to walk to her own apartment to check on her sleeping children. Her route took her past the McCann's apartment, 5A. This journey, by her own timing, occurred before Kate McCann would later make her own check and discover the empty bed. As she walked, she reported passing Gerry McCann, who was standing and talking with another holidaymaker just at the end of the road. She continued on. It was moments later that she claimed to have seen something that would become the absolute cornerstone of the abduction theory. A figure, a man, was walking quickly away from the direction of the resort. He was not, in her description, a casual stroller. He was moving with purpose. She described a man of medium height, with dark hair, and wearing dark or beige-colored trousers and a jacket. Most importantly, he was not alone. He was carrying a child. The child, she said, was small, and was being carried in an awkward way, horizontally, not nestled against the man's shoulder as a parent might carry a sleeping child. The child had bare feet, and was dressed in what appeared to be light-colored pajamas, possibly patterned. She thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was simply another parent taking their child home. When the alarm was raised just a short time later, her observation was instantly transformed. It was no longer a passing detail. It was the key. This was the moment. This was the abductor. Her account was explosive. It was the first, and for a long time, the only eyewitness testimony that supported the idea of a stranger. This figure, conjured from a fleeting glimpse, became known to the world as Tanner Man. A sketch was created based on her description, a featureless silhouette carrying a small bundle. This image would be reproduced millions of times, plastered on newspapers, and broadcast across the globe. It became the icon of the case. But the significance of her testimony went far beyond just providing a suspect. It created the timeline. Gerry McCann's check had been at approximately 9 to 10. Jane Tanner's sighting was estimated at 9:15. This left an impossibly narrow window of just 5 minutes, 300 seconds for an intruder to have entered the apartment, located the child, opened the complex shutter and window, exited without leaving a trace, and been seen walking away. The entire theory of a premeditated, stealthy abduction now rested entirely on this tiny, 5-minute gap. The weight of the whole case, the entire global search, was placed upon this single, fleeting observation. For the global public, the story of Tanner Man was the story of the abduction. It was the single, solid fact in a sea of confusion. But for the investigators on the ground, this account, the very foundation of the abduction theory, was proving to be deeply problematic. When they began to apply pressure to it, this cornerstone did not hold firm. It began to show profound cracks. The first inconsistency was immediate and glaring. Jane Tanner's statement was precise. She had walked directly past Gerry McCann, who was standing at the top of the street engaged in conversation with another man from their holiday group, Jeremy Wilkins. This was not a distant observation. This was a close-quarters event. Yet, when investigators questioned the two men, their recollections did not support her statement. They both remembered the conversation they were having. They remembered standing there, in the quiet night air. But neither of them recalled seeing Jane Tanner walk past them. More critically, neither of them recalled seeing any other person, let alone a man moving purposefully while carrying a child in distinctive, light-colored pajamas. How could two alert adults, standing in that exact location at that exact moment, miss something so dramatic? It was an observation that, by all rights, should have been shared by 3 people, but it was held by only 1. The second crack appeared in the evolution of the memory itself. In the initial chaotic hours, the description was fleeting, a dark figure, moving quickly. But in subsequent interviews, as the days and weeks passed, the description did not fade, as memory naturally does. It grew sharper. It became more elaborate. The beige trousers were now described as chino style. The jacket and trousers were recalled as possibly being of a similar material. Details that were impossible to ascertain in a brief glimpse, in poor lighting, were suddenly emerging with clarity. This suggested to investigators that the memory might not be a pure recollection of a single event, but perhaps a composite, a memory contaminated or reinforced by suggestion, stress, or the desperate need to provide an answer. But the most devastating blow to the credibility of the Tannerman sighting was yet to come. As the investigation widened its net, suspicion fell upon a local man, Robert Murat. He was an Anglo-Portuguese resident who lived nearby and had drawn attention to himself by offering to help the investigation. Jane Tanner was asked if she recognized him. Her identification was reported to be one of confidence. This was the man. The build, the gait, the appearance, it matched the figure she had seen carrying the child. It was a breakthrough moment that seemingly confirmed her account and identified the phantom. But it was completely wrong. Robert Murat's alibi was unshakable. He provided verifiable proof that he was elsewhere at the time of the sighting. He was an innocent man. This catastrophic misidentification changed everything. It proved that her memory, the very memory upon which the entire abduction timeline rested, was profoundly fallible. If she could be so certain and yet so fundamentally wrong about the identity of the man, how could her description of the event itself be trusted? The Tannerman sighting, once the pillar of the case, had now become its greatest liability. The 5-minute window it had created was collapsing, and investigators were forced to question if the sighting had happened at all. With the Tannerman sighting compromised by its own internal contradictions and the devastating misidentification of an innocent man, the official abduction narrative was left without an anchor. The investigation, and indeed the world's media, desperately needed a new direction, a confirmation that a predatory figure was, in fact, operating in the Algarve. That confirmation appeared to arrive not from Praia da Luz on the night of the disappearance, but from a different location and a different time. The story had to move backwards, 4 days before Madeleine vanished. The narrative shifts to Sunday, April 29th, in the nearby coastal village of Sagres. A man named Nuno Lorenzo, a local resident, came forward to the police with a story that, in retrospect, seemed to be a chilling prologue. He reported an encounter that had left him deeply uneasy. He had been on Mareta Beach with his family when he noticed a man who simply did not fit in. This individual was not there for the sun or the sea. He was dressed strangely for the setting: cream, colored trousers, a matching jacket, and polished brown shoes. What truly alarmed Lorenzo, however, was the man's behavior. He was holding a camera, but not in the manner of a tourist capturing memories. He held it at waist level, pointing it covertly toward Lorenzo's young children, clicking in secrecy. Lorenzo stated that he felt an immediate wave of suspicion and moved his family away. The incident, disturbing as it was, might have ended there, dismissed as just a strange and unsettling encounter. But according to Lorenzo's account, it did not. Later that same day, his family was outside a pastry shop in the village. The same man reappeared. This, Lorenzo claimed, was no coincidence. The man loitered nearby, staring intently at his young daughter. The atmosphere of unease turned, in Lorenzo's telling, to one of active threat. He claimed the man moved quickly, positioning himself as if to block the family's exit, a clear and aggressive move toward the child. Lorenzo described a moment of pure panic, believing he was witnessing the prelude to an abduction. In this moment of alleged terror, Lorenzo pulled out his mobile phone to photograph the man. He would later tell police that his own finger had blocked the lens, resulting in no usable image of the suspect. However, he claimed he was able to take a photograph of the man's car as he departed, a gray Renault Clio. He also managed to memorize a portion of the vehicle's registration plate. This is where the story takes a deeply perplexing turn. Faced with what he described as a clear and terrifying attempted kidnapping of his own child, Nuno Lorenzo did not call the police. He did not report the incident that day. He did not report it the next day. In fact, he waited nearly a week. He only came forward on May 5th. This was 2 full days after Madeleine McCann's disappearance had become the biggest news story on the planet, and, crucially, it was just after the man he had seen, the Polish holidaymaker named Wojciech Krakowski, had already boarded a flight and left the country. The delay was inexplicable, yet the information was explosive. For the Portuguese investigators, this was the breakthrough they had been pressurized to find. It was external corroboration. It was evidence. They now had a description, a car, and a partial plate. The car was quickly traced to Krakowski. The narrative now had its first tangible suspect, a face and a name. This new figure, Sager's man, was not just a fleeting shadow in the dark like Tanner Man. He was a real person, identified, who had been covertly photographing children and allegedly attempting an abduction just days before, and just miles away from the scene of Madeleine's disappearance. It seemed, at last, that the pieces were fitting together. On the surface, the story of Sager's man was a turning point. It provided what the investigation had been sorely lacking: a tangible lead, a name, a vehicle, and a disturbing backstory of prior predatory behavior. It seemed to confirm that a dangerous individual had indeed been operating in the Algarve, stalking children. The media seized upon this, broadcasting the details of Wojciech Krakowski, the Polish tourist, far and wide. The Portuguese police, acting on this seemingly solid information, mobilized international resources. Interpol was alerted. Authorities in Germany and Poland were contacted, and Krakowski was eventually tracked down in Warsaw. His home was searched, his belongings scrutinized. But even as this international chase was gaining momentum, serious, corrosive doubts were forming around Nuno Lorenzo's testimony. The story, which had appeared so solid, began to unravel under the slightest pressure, revealing improbabilities and too perfect coincidences. The first and most glaring issue was the description itself. Lorenzo described the man in Sagres with peculiar specificity: cream, colored trousers, a matching jacket, and polished shoes. He was an outsider, someone who did not look like a tourist. This description created a jarring echo. It was almost identical to the description provided by Jane Tanner of her T-Phantom in Praia da Luz, a man in beige trousers and a jacket, who also did not look like a tourist. To skeptical observers, this was not corroboration. It was choreography. It seemed highly improbable that 2 separate, independent witnesses, in different towns and on different days, would both be struck by the almost identical, and rather unusual, fashion choices of their respective phantoms. It suggested that one story might have been used as a template for the other, that a description was being recycled to fit a necessary narrative. Then there was the fatal, inexplicable flaw in Lorenzo's account: the delay. This was not a minor inconsistency. It was a detail that defied all human logic and parental instinct. Lorenzo claimed he had witnessed a direct, aggressive attempt to kidnap his own daughter. He was so certain, so terrified, that he fumbled for his phone. This is not an event one dismisses. It is not an encounter one sleeps on. The only rational, human response to such a moment of terror is an immediate call to the police. Yet, Nuno Lorenzo did not call. He did not report the man's description. He did not provide the partial plate number of the gray Renault Clio. He waited. He waited through that Sunday. He waited through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. He only came forward on Friday, May 5th. By this time, the news of Madeleine McCann's disappearance was a global firestorm. And, most conveniently, Wojciech Krakowski's flight had already left Portuguese soil. His report, therefore, was not a warning that could have led to an immediate arrest and potentially prevented a future crime. Instead, it was a piece of information delivered after it was safe to do so, offered up to an investigation that was desperate for any lead, no matter how flawed. The evidence he did provide also collapsed under scrutiny. He claimed his finger had conveniently blocked the lens only when he tried to photograph the man. Yet he managed to capture a clear image of the car. Furthermore, later analysis of his photo reportedly showed the car was not a Renault Clio at all, but a different model entirely. He also claimed to have written down the registration number on a piece of paper, only to have thrown it away, an implausible act for a father who believed he had just documented a potential kidnapper. The Sagers man story, therefore, was beginning to look less like a clue and more like a construct. It served a crucial purpose. It gave the media a face, and it gave the police a foreigner to chase. It sent investigators on an international pursuit, burning precious time and resources, all while distracting from the deeply troubling forensic silence back in apartment 5A. It was, in effect, a perfect diversion. And then, a final chilling connection emerged, a thread that seemed to tie the flawed phantoms together. It was discovered that Wojtek Krakowski, during his holiday, had been staying in an apartment block built by Robert Murat's father and managed by his family's company. Robert Murat, the very same innocent man whom Jane Tanner had falsely identified as her phantom. The two primary abductor sightings, Tanner Man and Sagers Man, were now linked, not by evidence, but by a strange and unsettling proximity to the same circle. The web was growing more complex, and the truth more distant. As the Tanner Man sighting dissolved under the weight of its own contradictions, and the Sagers Man account began to look more like a convenient fabrication than a genuine clue, the investigation was left adrift. The abduction theory, so critical to the public narrative, was failing. It was in this vacuum that a third, and perhaps most compelling, witness account emerged from the periphery. This information came not from within the holiday group, nor from a witness with a flawed and delayed story. It came from a family of ordinary tourists, entirely independent of the case, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. An Irish family, the Smiths, had been vacationing in Praia da Luz during that same period. On the night of May 3rd, they had been walking back to their own accommodation after a late meal. Their route took them through the quiet, winding streets of the resort. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. This time was critical. It was a full 45 minutes after Jane Tanner's disputed sighting at 9:15 and placed the event well outside the narrow 5-minute window that had once defined the case. As Martin Smith, along with several members of his family, walked along a small street named Rua da Escola Primaria, they encountered a figure walking in the opposite direction. The figure was a man, and he was carrying a child. At first glance, the scene was unremarkable, a common sight in a family resort. But the details of the encounter, recalled later, would become unsettlingly specific and profoundly haunting. The man was carrying the child awkwardly, not held close in a protective embrace, but almost draped over his shoulder, as if he were carrying a package. The child, they noted, appeared to be asleep. The description of the child was a chilling echo of the missing girl, 3 or 4 years old, with pale skin and blonde hair. Most disturbingly, the child was dressed only in light-colored pajamas and was barefoot, despite the pronounced chill in the night air. The man himself was described as being in his mid-30s, of medium build, with brown hair. He was not dressed like a tourist enjoying the nightlife. He wore beige trousers and a dark jacket. He walked quickly, with a sense of purpose, not looking at the family as he passed. His head was down, and he was moving steadfastly in the direction of the town center, toward the beach. The encounter was brief, lasting only a few seconds, and the family continued on their way, unaware of the significance of what they had just seen. Like the Sagres sighting, this information did not immediately reach the authorities. The Smith family had no knowledge of the disappearance until the following morning. Even then, they did not instantly connect their brief, unremarkable passage with the frantic search that was beginning. It would take 13 days before they formally came forward and provided their statement to the police, but when they did, their testimony changed the entire landscape of the investigation. It was independent, it was credible, and it suggested the child was alive and being moved through the town at 10 Mister, a full hour after her parents had originally raised the alarm. This new phantom, Smith Man, instantly became the most solid lead the investigation had. The Smith sighting, for many weeks, was treated as just that, a sighting. It was a credible piece of information from an independent source, certainly the strongest lead to date, but it was still just one data point in a growing ocean of theories and dead ends. The family had provided their statement, describing the man, the child, and the time approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. The information was filed. The investigation continued its frantic, outward search for a phantom. Months passed. The immediate chaotic search evolved into a long-term, global campaign. The faces of Kate and Gerry McCann were no longer just the faces of grieving parents. They were fixtures on international television, the public leaders of a sophisticated and relentless search operation. Their images were broadcast daily, their appeals carried on news networks across the world. They were, perhaps, the most recognizable couple on the planet. It was during this period of intense media saturation that Martin Smith, the Irish father who had provided the sighting, was watching one such news broadcast. He was observing events from his home, far removed from the epicenter of the case. The news report showed footage of the McCanns. He watched as Gerry McCann, engaged in the campaign, moved, holding one of his other children, the twin. In that instant, Martin Smith experienced what he would later describe as a bolt from the blue. It was a moment of shocking, visceral, and unwelcome recognition. It was not the face alone that triggered the reaction. It was the posture, the way the father held his own child, the specific, slightly awkward manner of the carry, the set of the shoulders, the movement. Smith described it as an action replay, a perfect, horrifying echo of the man he had seen walking purposefully through the streets of Praia da Luz on the night of May 3rd. He was paralyzed by the realization. This was not a vague resemblance. It was a deep, instinctive recognition of the man's specific physicality and motion. This was a development of such gravity that Smith knew he could not remain silent. He recontacted the authorities, this time with a piece of information that was almost unthinkable. He informed them of his realization. The man he had seen carrying the barefoot, blonde child at 10 o'clock that night, the child he believed was Madeleine McCann, bore an undeniable and specific resemblance to the child's own father. He was, he stated, between 60 and 80% certain that the man he had seen was Gerry McCann. This revelation was seismic. It sent shockwaves through the private channels of the investigation. It fundamentally and terrifyingly altered the entire landscape of the case. This was not like the Tanner sighting, which had been compromised by a clear misidentification of an unrelated third party. This was an independent witness, with no agenda, making a direct and specific identification of a central figure. The revelation instantly divided opinion and created an impossible dilemma. To supporters of the McCanns, and indeed to many investigators, this was a clear and tragic case of false recognition. Martin Smith's memory, they argued, had been contaminated. After months of seeing Gerry McCann's face on television, his brain had simply and incorrectly superimposed that image onto the hazy recollection of a stranger seen in poor lighting. It was a terrible coincidence, nothing more. But to critics, and to those who looked closer, this was the opposite of contamination. It was confirmation. The specificity of the recognition, the fact that it was triggered by movement and posture, not just a static face, was too acute to be dismissed. It was not "I saw a man who looked like him." It was "I saw a man who moved like him." This placed investigators in an impossible position. The Smith sighting directly contradicted the official timeline provided by the Holiday Group, which placed Gerry McCann at the Tapas restaurant at 10 o'clock. To believe Martin Smith meant that the group's alibis were incorrect. To believe the group's alibis meant that Martin Smith's visceral, independent recognition was a complete illusion. The Smith sighting was no longer a simple, external clue. It had become a terrible fulcrum, pivoting the entire case on a single point. It presented two realities. Either Martin Smith's memory had profoundly failed him, creating a phantom from a familiar face, or his memory was terribly, accurately correct, implying a truth that was, in every sense, unthinkable. Martin Smith's haunting recognition that potential, 80% certainty of a resemblance sent an unrecorded shockwave through the investigation. It was a piece of information so toxic, so fundamentally contradictory to the official timeline of the Tapas Group, that it threatened to collapse the entire framework of the case. The Smith man sighting could no longer be treated as a simple external lead. It was now a deeply problematic and divisive piece of testimony. Following such a critical sighting, the next logical, procedural step would be the creation of an EFIT, a composite sketch. This was the standard operating procedure in any major investigation, to take the memory of the witness and translate it into a face that could be shared with the public, a face that could be identified, a face that could, perhaps, confirm or deny the unsettling resemblance that Martin Smith had reported. In the year 2008, this process did, in fact, take place. Private investigators, then employed by the McCann's own fund, commissioned artists to sit with the Smith family. The goal was to finally put a face to the phantom who had walked the Rua da Escola Primaria at 10 o'clock that night. The process was undertaken. The sketches were created. The world waited, desperate for any image that could lead to a breakthrough. And then, nothing. The sketches, the most critical visual evidence yet produced in the entire case, were not released. They vanished. They were filed away, suppressed from public view. This decision was, to outside observers, utterly incomprehensible. A global, multi-million-pound search operation was underway, ostensibly to find the very man the Smith family had described. Appeals were being made daily. The media was saturated with the story. Yet the actual face of the suspect, as recalled by the most credible witnesses to date, was kept hidden. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3. The trail grew colder. The mystery deepened. The intense media focus began to fade. Still, the images remained under lock and key. Why? This silence became a mystery in itself. Why commission sketches only to bury them? Was it because the images failed to produce a clear likeness? Or was it, as skeptics began to whisper, because they had succeeded too well? Did one of the resulting images look too much like the unsettling resemblance Martin Smith had reported? To release such an image would have been tantamount to accusing the father himself, an act that would have been untenable. The sketches remained suppressed for 5 long years. Then, in October of 2013, everything changed. Scotland Yard, which had launched its own high-profile review of the case, held a major televised press conference. They announced that they were centering their investigation on the Smith sighting. It was, they declared, the most important lead. And as part of this new appeal, broadcast on the BBC's Crime Watch, they finally released the images. But the release did not bring clarity. It brought only profound confusion. The public was not shown one face of Smith man. They were shown two separate sketches, both allegedly drawn from the recollections of the Smith family, depicting the same man. The problem was immediate. The 2 men in the sketches looked like entirely different people. One sketch showed a man with a fuller, broader face, a wider nose, and a more rounded chin. The other showed a man with a much longer, narrower face, a sharper jawline, and thinner features. They were irreconcilable. How could the same brief, fleeting sighting, in the dark, by the same group of witnesses, produce 2 composites that were so fundamentally different? This only deepened the mystery. Had the witnesses given conflicting descriptions, or had the images been drawn from 2 entirely different memories within the group? Furthermore, it raised the uncomfortable question of plausibility all over again. The Smiths themselves admitted the sighting lasted only seconds under poor street lighting. How had such a momentary glimpse of a man with his head down been transformed into such specific, finely drawn and contradictory portraits? The sketches, intended to be the investigation's greatest weapon, had become another enigma. Their 5-year suppression remained unexplained, and their eventual, contradictory release, rather than identifying a suspect, served only to highlight the deep and disturbing inconsistencies that lay at the very heart of the case. The televised Crime Watch appeal in October of 2013 was a meticulously choreographed media event, the culmination of Scotland Yard's exhaustive, multi-million-pound review, known as Operation Grange. It was their moment to reset the entire public understanding of the case. As explored, The first part of this strategy was the unprecedented release of the two contradictory Smithman sketches, effectively shifting the public's focus to the 10 o'clock timeline. But this created an immediate and glaring logical problem. What about Tanner Man? For 6.5 years, the 9/15 sighting by Jane Tanner had been the single most dominant, most debated, and most foundational piece of the abduction narrative. It was the sighting that had defined the impossible 5-minute window. It was the sighting that had led to the vilification of Robert Murat. It was the sighting that had consumed tens of thousands of investigative hours. Operation Grange could not simply ignore it. They had to neutralize it. On the program, Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, the public face of the operation, stepped forward to announce what he presented as a monumental breakthrough. He stated that after a painstaking re-examination of all available data, they had solved the mystery of Tanner Man. The revelation was stunning. Jane Tanner, he explained, had seen a man carrying a child at 9:15, exactly as she had claimed. She was not mistaken in what she saw. She was only mistaken in who she saw. The figure, Redwood announced, was not an abductor. He was, in fact, an innocent British holidaymaker. This man, an unnamed father, was simply walking back to his own apartment after collecting his own 2-year-old daughter from the resort's evening creche, which was known to staff as the night creche. This new, convenient figure was immediately given a name, Crashman. This announcement was a masterpiece of narrative redirection. In one single, televised statement, the most problematic piece of evidence in the entire case was surgically removed. Jane Tanner was no longer a compromised witness whose testimony had collapsed. She was now a reliable witness who had simply misinterpreted an innocent event. The sighting was simultaneously validated and dismissed. But the convenience of this new solution was, to skeptical observers, breathtaking. It raised far more questions than it answered. The most obvious and alarming question was one of silence. This innocent father, this Crashman, had supposedly been at the very epicenter of the world's biggest news story. He had seen the Tanner Man sketch, an image that was, by Operation Grange's own admission, a depiction of him carrying his child. He had watched for 6.5 years as an innocent man, Robert Murat, was hounded by the global press for being the man he was mistaken for. He had watched the McCanns appeal to this very phantom to come forward. And yet, through all of this, for more than 6 years, he had said absolutely nothing. He had never once picked up the phone to call the police, either in Portugal or the United Kingdom, to say, "You are looking for the wrong person. That was me. That was my daughter. Please stop the search." This period of silence stretches the bounds of all credibility, but the story became even more convenient. To explain why Jane Tanner had been so certain, Operation Grange added another layer. They announced that this innocent father's daughter, the child being carried home from the creche, just so happened to be wearing light-colored pajamas. Pajamas that were, they claimed, uncannily similar to the very ones Madeleine herself was wearing that night. To the investigators, this was presented as the final piece of the puzzle, the detail that explained the tragic mistake. To critics, this was not a coincidence. It was a narrative detail too perfect to be real. It was a patch, fabricated to perfectly cover the hole in the original story. The Crashman solution was, in effect, the fourth phantom. But this phantom was different. He was not a suspect. He was a solution. His role was not to be hunted, but to officially erase the first phantom, Tanner Man. And in doing so, he achieved the investigation's primary strategic goal. He completely demolished the 9/15 timeline. The impossible 5-minute window, which had troubled investigators from the very first night, was gone. With Tanner Man officially explained away as Crashman, the investigation had successfully cleared the board. The public's attention was now skillfully and forcibly redirected to the only timeline that remained, the 10 o'clock sighting. The focus was now entirely and exclusively on Smith Man. The October 2013 Crime Watch appeal was, in retrospect, far more than a simple request for public information. It was a profound and deliberate act of narrative re-engineering. It was the moment the official story of the Madeleine McCann case was fundamentally rewritten, live, in front of an audience of millions. With the calculated introduction of Crashman, Operation Grange had not just offered a solution to an old puzzle. They had executed a controlled demolition of the case's entire original foundation. The implications of this maneuver were staggering. For 6.5 years, the entire case had been defined by, and trapped within, the Tannerman sighting. It was this singular observation at 9:15 that had created the infamous 5-minute window between Gerry McCann's 9 to 10 check and the sighting of the alleged abductor. This window, 300 seconds, had always been the abduction theory's greatest weakness. It was a time frame that defied logic. Critics, and indeed many investigators, had long argued that this window was simply too small for a stranger to have committed the act as described. How could a phantom intruder, in this impossibly short time, have entered the apartment, assessed the room, selected one child while leaving the 2 other children undisturbed, operated the complex and notoriously noisy external shutter and window combination, exited without leaving a single fiber or fingerprint, and then be seen walking calmly away? This timeline did not suggest a stealthy, planned abduction. It suggested a chaotic, rushed event, or, more troublingly, a fiction created after the fact to explain an absence. This 5-minute window was the central, agonizing problem of the case. For the official abduction narrative to survive, this timeline had to be broken. And so, Crashman was introduced. He was the perfect narrative tool. His appearance was not a discovery, it was a solution. He was the key that unlocked the investigation from its self-imposed prison. By providing an innocent explanation for the 9:15 sighting, his story achieved something monumental. It completely erased the 5-minute window. It vaporized it. The genius of the Crashman solution was its psychological precision. It did not accuse Jane Tanner of lying. On the contrary, it validated her. It told her, and the world, that her memory was correct. She had seen a man carrying a child in pajamas. Her only error was one of interpretation. This approach allowed Operation Grange to discard her testimony as evidence of a crime, without having to discredit her as a person. It was a surgical, clean, and devastatingly effective maneuver. With the Tannerman sighting now officially neutralized, the timeline of the disappearance was instantly and dramatically transformed. The narrative was no longer shackled to 9:15. The abduction window was suddenly stretched, expanded from a frantic 5 minutes to a much more plausible 45 minutes, spanning the time from the last Allwell sighting by Jane Tanner, who was now an innocent witness, to the Smithman sighting at 10 o'clock. This was the great timeline shift. This new, larger time frame worked. A stranger could operate within 45 minutes. A kidnapper could have watched the apartment, waited for an opportunity, entered, secured the child, and made a careful escape. The abduction theory, which had been dying under the weight of logical impossibility, was suddenly given new life. It was now plausible again. But this strategic victory came at a fascinating and deeply ironic price. In successfully diverting the world's attention away from the Tannerman problem, Operation Grange had performed a massive act of funneling. They had effectively taken a complex case, littered with dozens of contradictory leads, the scent dogs, the forensics, the Sagers man, the Tanner sighting, and wiped the board clean. They had implicitly instructed the public, forget everything you have heard for the past 6 years. Forget the 9:15 sighting. This is the only moment that matters. The man on the Rua da Escola Primaria at 10 o'clock. Every investigative resource, every newspaper headline, every ounce of public suspicion was now channeled, with the full force of Scotland Yard, onto a single point in time. The entire weight of the world's most famous mystery now rested on the shoulders of one sighting, the Smithman sighting. And in doing so, Operation Grange had, perhaps unintentionally, funneled the world's focus directly onto the one phantom that carried the most toxic and unsettling resemblance of all the one witness, who remained 60 to 80% certain that the man he saw carrying the missing child was, in fact, her own father. The great shift had not led to a stranger. It had, in the most profound irony, led the investigation full circle, right back to the very beginning. The great timeline shift, executed by Operation Grange, was a tactical success. It had neutralized the toxic 9:15 window and focused the entire world's attention onto the 10 o'clock Smithman sighting, but in doing so, it had simply exchanged one failing narrative for another. The Smithman sighting, upon which the entire official abduction theory now rested, was perhaps the most compromised of all. This sighting was a paradox. It could not be trusted, yet it could not be dismissed. Its flaws were profound. The inexplicable 5-year suppression of the composite sketches was a red flag of immense proportions, suggesting the images contained information that was, for some reason, considered too dangerous to release. When they were finally made public, the fact that they depicted two completely different men shattered any claim to reliability. It was impossible to launch a manhunt for a suspect who had two contradictory faces, both allegedly drawn from the same fleeting glimpse in the dark. And then, looming over all of it, was the central, unthinkable core of the sighting. Martin Smith's 60 to 80% certainty of an unsettling resemblance to Gerry McCann. This fact made the sighting unusable as a foundation for any official investigation. If the resemblance was false, it was a contaminated memory. If it was true, it implied a reality that the entire global campaign was designed to refute. Smithman, the last phantom standing, was not a foundation at all. It was a black hole. It is at this point that one must step back from the individual trees to see the shape of the forest. The story of the investigation is not the story of a search for one man. It is the story of a series of men. A parade of phantoms, each conjured at a critical moment, and each collapsing under the slightest scrutiny. This is the central thesis of researchers like Richard D. Hall, that the abduction narrative is a fiction, supported not by evidence but by a collection of unreliable and contradictory sightings. There were 4 phantoms. The first was Tanner Man, the original pillar. He was the 9:15 sighting that established the abduction timeline. He collapsed because he was not seen by 2 other witnesses standing feet away, and because his witness, Jane Tanner, definitively and incorrectly identified an innocent man, Robert Murat. He was proven to be an unreliable construct. The second was Sagra's man, the prologue. He was the predatory figure, Wojtek Krakowski, who supposedly established a pattern of prior behavior. He collapsed because the witness's inexplicable delay in reporting defied all parental logic, ensuring the suspect was safely out of the country before he was ever named. He further collapsed because his physical description was a too perfect echo of Tanner Man, and his sighting was strangely linked by location to Robert Murat, suggesting choreography, not coincidence. The third was Smithman, the replacement. He was the 10 o'clock sighting from a credible, independent family. He collapsed because the evidence he produced, the sketches, was suppressed for 5 years and then revealed to be hopelessly contradictory. And he collapsed, most significantly, because the sighting carried the toxic, unthinkable resemblance to the child's own father. The fourth was Crashman, the solution. This phantom was different. He was not a suspect. He was a narrative tool, invented for the sole purpose of erasing the first phantom. He collapsed under the weight of his own profound implausibility. His 6.5-year silence, while an innocent man was hounded in his place, is a detail that defies all human decency and belief. His existence, complete with the too perfect detail of the matching pajamas, was a convenience too far. What remains when these 4 phantoms are stripped away? What is left when the stories are exposed as flawed, contradictory, and deeply suspicious? The answer is nothing. There is no forensic evidence of a break-in at apartment 5A. There are no fibers. There are no traces of forced entry. There is no foreign DNA. The only fingerprint found on the window belonged to Kate McCann. The only witnesses that did provide physical signals, the specialized scent dogs, pointed not to a stranger leaving the apartment, but to the scent of death inside the apartment and later, in the boot of the rental car. The realization is stark. The entire global search for an abductor, the millions of pounds spent, the televised appeals, the worldwide media campaign, it has all been a chase for shadows. The phantoms were not clues to be solved. They were, as Hall's research concludes, a psychological operation. They were narratives, manufactured and managed, to feed the press and control the story. Their purpose was never to find the truth. Their purpose was to replace the truth. They were created to divert the world's attention away from the one place the evidence had always pointed, the silent, forensically clean room of apartment 5A. The case of Madeleine McCann, as it has been presented to the world, is, in reality, two entirely different stories. These two stories have run parallel to one another for all these years, one in the blinding glare of the global media, the other in the silent, suppressed pages of official reports and in the analysis of independent researchers. The first story is the one the world was sold. It is the story that began on the night of May 3rd, 2007. It is a grand, terrifying, and compelling myth, the myth of the phantom abductor. This is the story of a shadowy stranger who violated a family sanctuary and vanished into the night. This narrative was the engine of the entire public campaign. It was a story that required a villain, and so, one was provided. In fact, 4 were provided. This story was propped up, at every critical juncture when it threatened to fail, by the appearance of a new phantom. There was Tanner Man, the original suspect, who established the impossible 5-minute timeline, but who collapsed under the weight of his own contradictions. There was Sager's Man, the convenient predator, whose story defied logic and whose timing ensured he was already gone. There was Smith Man, the independent witness, whose testimony was buried for 5 years and was hopelessly compromised by contradictory sketches and an unthinkable, toxic resemblance. And finally, there was Crash Man, the narrative solution, a phantom invented not to be hunted, but to erase the first phantom, a fabrication whose 6.5-year silence defies all human reason. As researchers like Richard D. Hall have meticulously demonstrated, these phantoms are not clues, they are illusions. They are a collection of unreliable, managed, and contradictory accounts, each deployed at a key moment to keep the abduction narrative alive. When one phantom failed, another was elevated to take its place. They were, in effect, a grand act of misdirection. Then, there is the second story. This is the story the evidence tells. It is a story with no phantoms. It is a story that does not begin with a stranger lurking in the shadows, but begins and ends inside the 4 walls of apartment 5A. It is a quiet, cold, and deeply unsettling story. It is the story of a crime scene that contained no evidence of a crime. A room with no forced entry, a window with no tool marks, a floor with no foreign footprints, a scene forensically sterile, with no unidentified DNA, no hairs, no fibers. The only fingerprints found on the window belonged to the child's mother. In this second story, the only witnesses that provided any physical signal at all were not human. They were the specialized scent dogs, trained to detect the one thing no one wanted to find. And these dogs signaled, not outside, but inside the apartment. They signaled in the living area. They signaled in the bedroom. And later, they signaled in the boot of a rental car, hired weeks after the disappearance. This is the great, terrible divide in the case. The public was given the story of the phantoms. The investigators, in their earliest secret report, were looking at the story of the scent dogs. This leads to the final, agonizing question. If the abduction story is a fiction, a narrative supported only by collapsing illusions, then why? Why was this vast, expensive, and sophisticated global machine created to promote it? The answer, as Hall's work concludes, is the dark, beating heart of the entire mystery. The story of the phantom abductor was not an investigation. It was an act of narrative substitution. It was a theft of justice. The goal was never to find the truth. The goal was to replace the truth. The objective was to create a story so loud, so emotional, and so compelling that it would drown out the quiet, terrible whispers coming from the evidence itself. It was an act of mass redirection, designed to ensure that the entire world would look outward to the streets, to the beaches, to foreign countries, in a hunt for a phantom, and never, ever look inward, at the apartment, at the timeline, or at the profound contradictions in the accounts of those present. This is where the tragedy moves beyond a missing child and becomes a case study in the mechanics of power. The media machine was activated. Public relations experts, with government-level experience, were on the ground in hours. The official Portuguese police report, the one that concluded the abduction theory was unsupported, was not just ignored, it was attacked, buried, and its author discredited. The Smithman sketches, which may have contained a resemblance too dangerous to show, were suppressed for 5 years. Even Operation Grange, Scotland Yard's high-profile review, served not to question the abduction theory, but to save it. With the introduction of Crashman, they performed narrative surgery, excising the failed Tannerman sighting to keep the phantom hunt alive. The legacy of the Madeleine McCann case, therefore, is not one of an unsolved mystery. It is the story of a solved mystery that was deemed unacceptable. It is a chilling demonstration of how truth itself can be managed, suppressed, and replaced with a more convenient fiction. The phantoms were the shields, the distractions, the theater created to hide a simple, devastating, and far more human event. The case endures, not because it is complex, but because the truth was buried under the weight of a narrative so powerful it became reality. The haunting question that remains is not who took Madeleine, but rather, what simple, terrible truth were the phantoms created to protect? And so, the phantoms collapse. One by one, the stories that defined this case for years are revealed to be illusions, contradictions, or convenient impossibilities. When we strip away these phantoms, we are left not with the story of an abduction, but with a story about an abduction. A narrative machine, so powerful it buried the truth for decades. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most disturbing and misunderstood cases. The mystery endures, not because it is complex, but because the truth was never meant to be found. We want to know what you think. What really happened in apartment 5A? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you found this investigation valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until then, stay vigilant and never stop questioning.